forget to remember. And that's a bad thing. We're meant to remember where we came from. There was a Bethel moment for most of us. I was thinking about what I would think about. I mean, I gave my life to Jesus. I grew up in church. I worked in dramas and worked with plays and sound and lights. And the first moment that I would say was my Bethel, though, was I was 13 years old. Pastor Chris took me on my first missions trip. Who lets a 13-year-old go to a foreign country? What's going on here? And so they took me as a 13-year-old to Peru, and we were on a missions trip, and we were praying with kids, and we were doing little crusades, and we were giving out toys and stuff, and just letting them, be loved. And we were praying on the rooftop of the hotel we were staying in, and I remember I'm on my knees, like openly weeping at the brokenness in the world, how terrible things are, how good I have it in America, how there must be something more than everything everyone's been telling me to pursue. And I remember the missionary put his hands on my shoulders and said, "You're going to preach." He said, "You're called into the ministry. You're designed for this. You're made for this. God's not done with you." And then he just said a bunch of other things. And I remember in that moment feeling as clear as day that God's like, "I have a plan for you." And I haven't looked back. I mean, there's been some bumps in the way, and I've tried to quit several times. But that was my holy moment that I come back to. And so that's my Bethel. So when I get tired and I'm exhausted and overwhelmed and I want to give up, and it happens, you're like, "Oh, pastors are great. They always feel close to Jesus and everything great." No! I've wanted to quit more times in the past 3 years than any other time in my life. It's hard working with people. Do you know that? You guys are hard to, no, I'm kidding. Right? It's hard to do what God has called you to do when there's so many factors. And so when I want to give up, when I want to quit, I go back to that holy moment where God says, "I'm calling you." These people didn't call you. This church didn't call you. The denomination you belong to didn't call you. When I say you're done, you can be done. And I have a Bethel moment that I have to go back to and say, well, if God has this plan for me, I better walk in it. And it's going back to Bethel that reminds me that God has called me and began a work in me. But it's not just about what he started. It's the second part we have to remember. We go back to Bethel to be reminded that God isn't finished. That God isn't finished, right? So often we become dissatisfied with life as we see it. It hasn't turned out maybe how we hoped, or it's been harder, or we just feel overwhelmed and listless right now. And so we have to go back to a holy moment. We have to go back to an experience with the transcendent and the supernatural to be reminded of the place where God has spoken to us, not because he started something there, but because he promised to finish it. Because he promised he's not done with us. I love how Paul says in Philippians 1:6, you might know this verse. It says, "I'm certain that God, who began the good work within you, will continue his work until it's finally finished on the day when Christ returns." Two quick takeaways from this verse. We understand that God's not done until Jesus comes back, which means that God is not finished with you. So go back and remember what God has started. But remember, he's not done either. That you're a work in progress. Be a little gentle with yourself because God is still working in you. And I know it might be rough. Listen, the guy who wrote this, Paul, right, he's been shipwrecked at least twice. He's been stoned at least 3 times. He's been beaten at least 3 times. He's been abandoned by his friends, right? He's been bitten by a snake. Like, he's had a rough life. If anyone wants to be like, "Hey, God, I don't think you're in this because life sucks right now," it's Paul. And Paul says, "I'm certain that he'll finish it." He's certain that God is working and will finish it, and he's certain. It's undoubted. So when you feel unmoored and tired, like you're done, go back to Bethel. Go back to something God did in you because he's going to finish it in you. Hold on for dear life. Or maybe you're going to have to let go for dear life because you've been holding on to the wrong things, and let go of Selfie to grab hold of God. I love what Jacob does at the end here in Bethel. He actually recalls God's promise back to him.